Hi, and thank you so much for taking time, maybe on your lunch break, maybe as part of your workday, to come to our panel. So the title of this panel is Design and Intersectionality. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a background on how we came to be discussing this. So this panel came out of a book club with coworkers in the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd protests last year. So for folks that don't know Carbon 5, we are a development. And this panel started as a blog series interviewing my coworkers about where we felt we weren't living up to our ideals around combating systemic racism and bias in tech. So if you're interested in this topic, I would love to have you check out the blog series. We are also doing a survey encouraging people to add their thoughts so that we can hear from sort of a broader group of people and just sort of understand where the tech industry and where designers are at on these conversations. So as I talked to my coworkers, we realized that Agile process, as we currently practice it, often excludes marginalized groups in the name of starting small. We also realized that as consultants, we spend more time thinking about how to make our work appeal to stakeholders than we do understanding the impact of our work once it's released. So a lot of the conversation about diversity in tech centers around and to create more inclusive workplace culture. But as an individual contributor, hi, I'm a principal designer at Carbon 5. I forgot to introduce myself. Hiring is not always within our control. So I wanted to focus this conversation on the products we build and how we can use the influence that we have as designers to combat systemic injustice. By the way, programming note, if you've got any questions for us, add them to the Q&A section so we can see them there. But for now, we pulled together a panel of really smart people with a range of experience in tech. And I'm going to go around the group and introduce them. I'm really excited to see what they have to say. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce Gintel G.
So, hi everybody. I am a senior product designer at Carbon 5. I've been there for almost coming up on a year, a little bit, but yeah, fairly new. And yeah, really excited to be here.
All right, Josh Kim.
Hey y'all, I'm Josh. I'm a civic tech designer and IAAP web accessibility specialist. Unfortunately, I'm not part of the amazing Carbon 5 cohort, but I'm really excited to be here representing AdHoc as a senior designer servicing Veterans Affairs. Before I worked at AdHoc, I was a UX researcher and designer at Deloitte Digital in DC, where I did a lot of consulting for federal agencies and state governments.
Welcome to the team. Tim McCoy.
Hi, I'm Tim. I'm a senior director of product design at Zendesk, and I have been working in product design development for far too long. I love it. Nowhere else I'd rather.
And finally, Jen Skene.
Hi there, I'm Jen Skene. I'm a senior product manager at Twilio Segment, and I'm a Carbon 5 alum. Prior to that, I worked in public science education.
Awesome. So I wanted to start off with some questions about how you even arrive at your building platform. I'm going to start with a question for Tim. When you're about to build a new product or feature, how do you arrive at an understanding of your audience?
So there's a couple of answers to that question, and I'm gonna kind of attack this from a kind of lean startup-y, like how do you haven't done a bunch of user research kind of situation. Because I think the canonical answer is, well, you do let user research and you make sure you go out and talk to your audiences, your customers, and blah, blah, blah. So you don't always get a chance to do that, or we don't get a chance to do that up front. And what we want to do is to kind of get people thinking about who your users might be as early in the process as possible. You can follow that up with more robust research, for sure. But one of the things that I would do a lot as a consultant is I consult with teams that were kind of envisioning a new product or extending a product to a new feature set, for a new product. And what I do is get into a room, or what we would do at Pivotal, where I've been prior to Zendesk. Often we get in a room with stakeholders, or a virtual room, done this remotely as well. And we want to get conversations centered around archetypal user type, right? Classic kind of get started with your users, conversations, workshops. But then as part of that process, it's really important to do a couple of things. For one is also envision and kind of get some focus on who are some anti-users, who are some potential users of this system who might wreak havoc, right? Who might use the system in ways that are not the way you primarily intend. So, for example, thinking about a two-sided marketplace app where you have some kind of relationship between people. So, of course, you have the I want to sell something, and I want to buy something. But you also have I want to put something online in order to make a connection with someone to take advantage of it. Think about that's a persona, that's a type that you have to design for and account for in your work. So yeah, I think that's a big thing, right? Like use those same user experience tools that we have for figuring out where our focus is, but be sure to include those more marginalized use cases as well as thinking about what could go wrong in this for this user, right? Like if we identify a particular user as having here's an archetype. Okay, well, how might she end up with a bad experience? And then great, now you have something to kind of defend against or work against.
So protecting the experience of the people you're making it for. So I want to get over to Gintel and ask, so when you're running this process and maybe don't have the sort of proper time to do the full user testing session, but you need to test your assumptions and maybe sort of gently correct assumptions you make really early in the process. How do you and your team go about discovering and reframing assumptions?
Yeah, so kind of speaking a little bit towards what Tim said about the personas. So I would basically use the personas to inform what audience do I need to test. Often I'm trying to get some type of qualitative testing where I get feedback, I get to see what they're saying about the product. And usually for qualitative testing, that persona really informs that. I usually try to focus on age and location, any key details. For example, right now we're working on an optometry product, and it was important to get people that wear glasses and contacts so that we're really getting the person that's going to use our product. And I think throughout the process, it's important to let these users speak for themselves. So you always want to get as much verbal confirmation or just information and feedback from your users as possible.
I think you've sort of brought up a really interesting point about the risk of not understanding who you're building for. So I wanted to pass to Jen and ask what some of the risks of designing for an audience with a different lived experience from you are, and how you deal with and counteract those risks.
Sure. I personally have had a couple of not awesome experiences with using personas where we've used personas and really anchored on sort of imaginary characteristics about people, this is a person who's a foodie, or this person loves to go out dancing with their friends. And folks kind of really dig into those characteristics, which are fun and really humanize this persona, but are kind of irrelevant in terms of how they interact with our product. And often we pick photographs that represent who is this person, and obviously that person is a specific race and a gender, and you kind of get anchored on that. And in some cases, I've just seen people be not super generous about, assumptions about this fake person. So I think we really need to realize that we come up with that persona for a reason, and it's really a snapshot of a potential person, and we tell that story. But that isn't always the best approach, especially when we realize that users are going to be many people who are all a combination of different characteristics. So thinking instead about like user archetypes, really focusing on what are their motivations and what are their actions, and like what are they actually doing with our product, what are their goals. Focusing on that instead of these sort of whimsical and imaginary characteristics, I think can be really helpful. And I think at this, because I work a lot with engineering teams who really are taking to heart, like, who is this for? And I think the better job we can do of making that real, it's just going to improve all the aspects of product development.
If you're comfortable, you shared a specific example to me of people maybe over-indexing on some of these traits in a persona, and I would love to hear that story as well.
Sure. Yeah. So we, this was actually some work that I did with Carbon 5, working on a financial services product, which was really geared at I'm like being super careful about what I'm saying here, but like on people who are really living at the margin of their paycheck, right? And are really coming up with creative ways to fund their lives. So I think there was a lot of lack of empathy for the users of this product. Like, this is not me. This is a person who is like has problems that are not my problems. And really, like, we had like a bunch of, we would call them heads, like photographs, headshots of people, and we would pick them out, like who's who, and people would pick out heads just to kind of like make fun of people, or sort of like have a sort of a lighthearted moment that kind of got a little bit sharp edged. So that was a super awkward moment where I'm like, oh, this is not at all what we're supposed to be doing here. Like, let's just diffuse this situation as quickly as we can and bring this into like a much more friendly place, because this is not the object of this this exercise. So that was just super awkward, and I was super sad to have that happen with the team, and it was kind of hard to come back from that and build up trust about wanting to think about our users in a way that is really understanding their problems and not ways to kind of marginalize them.
I want to follow up on that sort of relationship in terms of building trust with stakeholders, but I also wanted to ask a little bit about how this confirmation bias shows up in research design. So Josh, I know you've done just a lot of research and you have a lot of knowledge about this. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you hold yourself accountable for confirmation bias?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And there's so many methods that we can use. I think the one that repeatedly comes to the top of mind for myself that you can use in any project, in any situation, regardless of constraints, is starting with a reflexive statement before you actually conduct any design or research work. Basically, on a piece of paper, ask yourself, what do I know? How do I know what I know? What shapes and has shaped my perspective? How have my perceptions and my background really affected what I've interpreted or designed? And by simply writing this down in a physical space, that kind of activates your system to thinking, and you can better reflect on what privileges you might have and what emotional baggage or biases, confirmation biases included, you might be actually bringing into your work. And this is something that might trigger some imposter syndrome or self-doubt, but I actually see that really as like a natural ethical superpower that we all kind of get at some point in our careers. Because I mean, at some point you kind of realize like, wow, people are really complex. I suck at designing people, and that's a good thing, because if we can be more open about it and use it as a motivation to bring the people we actually design for into our work, that would be awesome. And Michael Padner actually wrote a lot about that. For y'all who are interested, Qualitative Research and Evaluation Methods is my favorite textbook of all time. He has a reflexivity checklist that you can Google up really quickly. And as I said earlier, anyone can do this, regardless of your project constraints. It's a personal activity. That being said, it's still only one edge of the triangle. Speaking of pattern, I'm also super big on this idea of triangulation. So for y'all who are really into quality research out there, triangulation is all about methods that increase the credibility and validity of research findings, which can go ahead and help mitigate confirmation bias. For example, you can have practitioner triangulation, which might involve having a designer actually run your usability test for you. Someone with ideally different lived experiences, so you don't allow your own, wants or hidden desires to really seep out in that and how you're doing the analysis or how you're even running the study. Methods triangulation, which means not relying on one method to conduct research, because oftentimes, say for example, if you were to conduct interviews with a diary study and not just interviews in general, that'll help round out your findings, but also opens up access to people who may not be comfortable being observed in an interview. People with disabilities who may not be able to access, be able to participate in like a Zoom video call interview because they use voice commands to interact with the products that they use. Maybe thinking about like whether or not you're depending on online whiteboards because folks who use screen readers might not be able to access that either. So thinking about the medium as a message, right? Theory triangulation, which might involve invoking different theoretical perspectives when analyzing your work. Like how would your analysis change if you approach this from a universal design perspective versus a design justice perspective? That might change your definition of success completely. And finally, source triangulation. Where are you drawing your sources from? Data can hold many different truths depending on who's actually publishing it and who's making sense of it. So doubting that, looking back on it, reflecting on it, these are all like some techniques that you might be able to take away from. But ultimately, the best way is to have a diversity. Recruit people with disabilities, work with them, hire them. I think that's the best way.
So I want to pass over to Tim because Tim is in a really interesting role. So as a director, he has input not only on hiring and creating that more diverse team that we're seeking out, but also sort of taking awareness of intersectionality and different constraints that users might face. So how can you foster awareness of intersectionality?
Yeah, so from a leadership perspective, and one of the things that myself and my colleagues do is really like in crits and design reviews, really probe those questions about like, well, did you consider the vectors for abuse in this scenario? Hey, this design is great. How does it play out for your situations with low bandwidth connections? Zendesk is a international company, right? We have dozens of languages that we translate our application into. And so, we're always looking for those things like, hey, is this not just in the language itself, but like, is this construct like a Western only thing, right? Things about like that, looking at trying to be the just the guidepost to like help to pepper those questions to make sure designers and product managers are thinking about those things. Another one, this came up in just over this last year, really recognizing how different, how many folks just have to deal with constant intermittent interruptions, right? And so thinking about, when we have some workflow that we're designing, right? Hey, are you thinking about this for the situation where someone just needs to put it down? Are they gonna have to start over? Is there a way to save their position when they come back to it later, even though, in normal situations, you'd expect, of course, I'll just do this and then be done with it, right? How do you account for that?
When I worked with you, Tim, one of the most powerful things I learned was to think about a user's experience over time and to really consider that. It was something that was really powerful. So shout out to Tim. So one of the things that when we discussed some of the topics beforehand, I thought was really interesting, but I wanted to pass to Jen too. is that ultimately we also have to make KPIs. We have to achieve certain business goals, and balancing the ethical concerns, the accessibility concerns that we know are really, really important with meeting these deadlines and finding sort of scope questions around this is sort of where the rubber meets the road. So I wanted to ask, and I feel like this is one that everybody is going to have something to say about. I know it's something I wish I had resolved, so please answer everything for me. Thank you. How do you make this work?
Yeah, so I think ideally you would make the like accessibility or just sort of the broad applicability-ness of your product part of the like KPIs of the product, part of the success, so that you're actually grading yourself on, are you successful at doing this aspect of the product right? And you have to kind of think of that up front, sell that to your stakeholders, and make the case for that. If you're not, if you didn't do that up front and you realized during your iterative process, like, oh, we didn't think about this, we need to change this and that, and make some changes on the fly. For me, what's most helpful is thinking about, okay, what are the options? What's the kind of set of possible solutions here? And pull in everybody on the team and just have conversations about that. Design, engineering, and just super, super important for me here, because it's always like, can we, like, kind of how much work is this? Can we still meet our deadline if we add this? Because it feels like scope creep if it's not one of those like KPIs there. So really just being open and creative with your team about what are ways you can fix this. I think that's so key. And that's where I think, what Tim was saying about having your whole team understand intersectionality and care about it, that's what's key, because people are going to come up with different solutions and really be able to have options that are things you can kind of, slot into a sprint and just like, okay, we can fix it in this way. We can make this incremental improvement. I think that's really key, just to have that partnership within the team.
I think there's also, I think to this degree, I want to key off of that idea of like, everyone on the team acknowledging, recognizing the importance of this stuff. And yeah, in a business, sometimes you're gonna want to move fast and start with a subset of your entire addressable audience, right? But I think one of the things that at the team member level you can do to influence these things is to bring up those concerns and those needs, right? Like, make your executive stakeholders be in the position of having to say, well, I don't care about low site users, or it's not. Meeting accessibility goals isn't important to me, right? Like those are becoming, just culturally, they're becoming less tenable positions to hold, right? And so it's kind of like holding your leadership accountable for, like, we think about these things and you need to think about them too. And it's on your shoulders to ignore that. Just trying to push some pressure, upward pressure.
I think it's a really interesting thing to information as you possibly can. So you're coming in with informed decisions, so when you get a stakeholder to say something like that, you have sort of everyone else in the room who knows a little bit more. So I wanted to ask Gintel if you have any advice on persuading stakeholders at the company to actually start with this more in-depth research, and persuading folks to slow down and take in a little bit more information before they start.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a big question when I had a job at Playboy, and their focus was mostly repurposing the magazine to a website. And I was the first designer that was hired there that had like this really big focus on UX. So they asked me like, okay, well, what would be the first thing that we do to kind of see what we need to change and, all those things. So the first thing that I did was a UX audit of the website. And I kind of used the business needs to kind of inform those three like different user roles that were important. And in that audit, I basically had like heuristic markups, and usability testing with other professionals that like kind of helps me like go through the site and kind of see, okay, like what is being said here, what is missing. And it really, really helped a lot. They had like things to focus on that you let them know like, okay, well, we have some e-commerce things going on. We have some subscription and membership things going on. And our site isn't necessarily geared towards it yet. At the time I joined, they didn't have the navigation surfaced on the site. So that was like a big thing. I was like, okay, we need to like give our user more control, more freedom, more ways to get around this website. And once I prioritized that, gave them solutions and gave them metrics to kind of verify all of those findings with, it really helped kind of shift the stakeholders' opinion of what they need to do and what's important about the website.
That's so cool. I wanted to ask Josh if he wanted to build on that a little bit, because it's a huge problem. I know as a consultant, I've heard a lot where you come to a culture just doesn't prioritize intersectionality. Maybe people feel comfortable saying like, no, we don't want to build for low site users. We are moving fast. We are maybe anxious about our funding, for example. If there's sort of an entrenched disregard for this, how do you challenge what's already been built? And this question is for Josh.
Yeah, I'd like to just kind of build off of what Gintel was saying in terms of doing like UX reviews. I think it's really brilliant when you're able to not only like go ahead and complete a heuristic evaluation, but to build on that, invite actual experts to help you out. So at Veterans Affairs, a recent project I was on involved redesigning application for disability benefits, the form that existed online. And we had a hunch that a lot of the questions on that form could be potentially triggering to veterans. And in this regard, right, A, I'm not a veteran. B, I don't come from a background of trauma-informed design or someone who actually knows what I'm talking about when it comes to such sensitive topics. So trying to be in a position of like authority or knowledge or know-how really isn't appropriate in this like particular context. So we found really useful is we actually contacted medical experts, people who have been working at Veterans Affairs for many, many, many years, and did a workshop with them, sat them down, had them walk through the form with us step by step, and having their feedback input into it, having their quotes ready to be actually shared out with our clients, the people who've worked with us, really did move the needle on trauma-informed design, which is really exciting. Beyond that, idea of just doing heuristic evaluations and reviews and inviting in experts, if we're just talking about trying to productively, like, say, challenge a company's understanding of their core user base, trying to get them to change their mind, in general, I think a really good start is to avoid placing people on the defensive. There's a really great book that I reference all the time called Structured Negotiation by Lainey Feingold, who helped actually negotiate the first web accessibility agreement in the United States in 2000. She has 25 years of case studies written in that book, all around productively challenging entire systems of oppression. That's amazing. And ironically, it's kind of all around being a dolphin, not a shark. For a lawyer, that's kind of weird, right? But open communication, transparency, collaboration, active listening, relationship building are the recipes for success here. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. Obviously, that's a lot more difficult for folks who don't have the privilege, time, or space to be able to do so actively. And I think that's precisely why those of us who do have the privilege to do so, me being an East Asian male in the United States, paying forward all the privilege that I've had, lived with up until this moment. And that means meeting stakeholders where they are, meeting people who may not know better where they are, creating safe spaces for them to ask the most ignorant questions and guiding them towards the right resources, helping them understand why it's important to design for marginalized groups, why intersectionality is a thing, without making them seem like the big bad wolf. Because when you make someone feel like they've excluded an incredible amount of people, or make them feel like there's some evil person, what you're going to end up realizing, what I've learned from my experience, is they will only do the bare minimum amount of compliance instead of going above and beyond expectations. So you have to be very strategic about how you use your language. That's why it's usually a good idea it's usually not a good idea to say something like, hey, we're pulling in this accessibility expert to explain why you're going to get sued, because the mention of expert and sued prompts two things: the need for them to bring in their own expert, so already it's becoming this us versus them situation, and the framing of the problem that's around being sued and money, instead of including people, centering them, will do so much more harm than good in the long run, if you think about it. And that's really the difference between the accessibility from the perspective of, hey, we'll go ahead and install ramp by the dumpster in the back, versus let's go ahead and redesign the entire system.
That's fantastic. I wanted to throw to Jen and ask if you have anything to layer onto that, because I think of you as someone who is just so effective at talking to stakeholders and really getting these concepts across in language that they are really comfortable hearing.
Yeah, I love, Josh, what you're saying about like not making it sort of an adversarial, like we've got to do this to avoid a lawsuit, right? So it's like, how can we think about this in a way that's like inspiring and aspirational to our stakeholders? Like, don't we want to make a product that is, you know, welcoming to everyone, especially XYZ, or, you know, don't we want to aspire to this and really make people proud of what they're creating and what they do day to day? So I think that's really like an opportunity to up level the whole project and the whole, I mean, even someone's whole, you know, job and how they see themselves and they see the work that they do, or they see the organization and their organization's goals. So I think that's really the opportunity that we're looking at, not just like, oh, here's a really expensive thing you have to do to prevent a lawsuit.
By the way, folks who are watching at home or at work, wherever you're watching, don't want to assume, feel free to ask some questions in the Q&A if there is stuff on this topic that you feel like you want to hear from folks on. But I wanted to ask both Gintel and Tim, when you are doing this design work and you have the ability to bring in more perspectives, what are some of the processes that you use to bring more perspectives and maybe more change to stakeholders into your design work? Let's start.
Start with me? Okay. So a lot of times when I'm trying to bring in different perspectives, I do basically like quick and dirty usability testing, where I'll bring in somebody who's really unfamiliar with the product, and I'll ask them, you know, like what they're seeing and how they think it works, things like that. And another thing, I have this thought like around edge cases. I think that we all have either been one or will become one. So I like to always not really think of it as an edge case and still kind of bring those thoughts in so that I am, you know, testing these people or just trying to see like, okay, well, is that really a valid edge case? And, you know, will there be a point in the product where we will need to consider this? That's what I always like to think about. And sometimes projects have this very vanilla, like, sense of their users where they're thinking it's all this certain type of person. So especially like being a Black woman, I always want to make sure that, you know, we're looking at diversity, we're looking at different types of people, and that we are including those people, even if I have to do it through a usability test that's a little bit outside of the framework that I have for the project. I'll pass it to Tim.
Okay.
Oh, you're muted.
There we go. I found it. Yeah, I was staying off on my mic. So I think there's two directions here. One is like Gintel was saying, bring people into the process. One of the things that is really valuable is to do participatory design exercises, right? Where you are not just asking for feedback and interpretation of the work that you're presenting, but you're actually establishing a space with a prospective user and saying, hey, here's a problem that we need to solve. How would you solve it? What would you like to see? How would you like to solve this, right? And these generally don't result in like, oh, great, I got out of the session, now I have my wireframe that we're going to go build, right? But it's that you get to see the way that they put certain areas of importance on the screen, or why they choose to include or not include a certain piece of information in a description, or things like that, right? So all that qualitative stuff, right, where you're just going out and trying to get just more exposure. I mean, it all comes down to exposure. And then the other direction is something totally different, which is this idea of purposely designing for evil, or a term that you'll hear called despicable design, where you purposely do this exercise where you're like, how can we make this experience the worst it could be? Like, what if I was, if we're going to launch this thing and it was just a train wreck, what would it be like? and that really helps you, like, it's like a brainstorming exercise, right? Where you end up getting to these dark places, and then you realize, like, wow, that actually, like, we have to make sure that we don't do that. We have to make sure that that's not possible, right? So that kind of turning the lens around and saying, like, how is this terrible? Let's not do that.
What do we have to absolutely not do?
Yes.
I actually have a question that I haven't sort of pre-asked you, but I'm really interested in what everyone has to say. I feel like we've heard a lot of really, really great insight on how to sort of do the beginning of the double diamond, how to bring in a lot of perspectives, get a lot of questions and unknowns on the table. But I feel like there's always a moment on the project where you understand that the problem space is massive, maybe more massive than you thought. You have to build the project, and you have to start making these decisions. So knowing just sort of how vast the range of perspectives are, what everything could go wrong is, how do you start narrowing this problem space down into solutions? And like I said, anyone who wants to go for it, just raise your hand.
Well, I can hop in.
Yeah.
I think one thing you can do is kind of think about all the different problems that you could be solving for, right? Like what I think Tim had mentioned, a two-sided marketplace. I launched a new feature recently, and a couple of customers who have a two-sided marketplace wanted to use this in a way we never imagined, right? It's like, oh yeah, you have completely different needs because you're not just helping your buyer, you're also helping sellers. That we just never thought about that. So we just said, that's really out of scope. We would love to help you, and this is a really cool problem, but this is not the problem we're solving right now. So we just kind of carve out things as like a really good, interesting problem, but not what we're doing right now. So we can really focus on what are we solving for? And the better we're able to articulate that and kind of explain and understand why we are solving the ones that we've chosen to solve, I think helps us maintain focus. Because if we're not focused as product makers, we're just creating a bunch of weird features that don't really help anybody. So I think, articulating all the places your product could go and where you're choosing deliberately to go right now and why is sort of a key part to that.
So I'm also curious in this group how that interacts with clients or folks elsewhere in the business who have very defined roadmaps and places they really want to reach. How do you negotiate sort of backburnering these problems, or sort of knowing that interesting problems that have been strategically deprioritized lie ahead of you, while knowing that there are other things that people want you to address? And this, again, is for anybody in totally off script here.
I'll hop in again. What is it about those big undefined things that are interesting to you, and how can you chip away at what would be the first steps for those things? What could you test even now? I'm trying to think of a recent example. We were thinking about redoing the whole way you like authorize into our product. Oh, we're doing a new little feature. Or a new little integration. Let's just redo auth for that one and see what's reusable, and how can we chip away at that big problem and de-risk it and understand the size of it, and is it even worth doing? So, like, just kind of pulling on a little thread and seeing where that gives you. Because if there's some giant, huge thing that seems cool but interesting, but you don't have time for it, you're probably never going to get to that thing. There's going to be other things that come up and are more actionable that are going to push that one into the bottom of the backlog forever.
Yeah, I'd
That's
like
real.
to hop on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to hop on this as well, because coming from like a background of accessibility, one of the things in the design world that typically gets shafted in that manner, saying like, oh, this is too big of a scope, we've already built up a product already, we can't start thinking about accessibility and wrapping it back in to the level in which it needs to be, is a conversation that, I think every accessibility specialist experiences several times, or a number of times in their career. And I think one of the difficult things, part of that is just, to Jen's point, finding out what can we take action on right now, what can we actually start working on. Something that we always say is shift left. So just at the very least, try and focus on what you can work right now. That might be strictly on the QA end of things, but slowly try and start making your way into more foundational changes. And if you can't do something, if we're, maybe changing this topic to intersectionality, if we're not bringing in folks in marginalized groups, and it's something that, people have said, like, we don't have the time to do it, we can't prioritize it, make them feel comfortable owning the fact that they're excluding people, document it. I think I asked this very similar question to Dave Thomas, who wrote Design for Cognitive Bias, and like challenging how people prioritize intersectionality and like, what should we do if we're unable to get that? And he said, document everything. If you're able to document these decisions, make sure that they're tracked, you're following up on it, saying like, hey, we're still excluding XYZ groups of people. Don't let it die. Make sure that's reminded on like a repeated basis. And that starts conversations. As Kat Holmes kind of puts it, recognizing exclusion really is the first step here.
So I'm going to ask a question from the audience. Shuhan Yang asked, how do you design for intersectionality at enterprise companies where the target user group is much narrower than the consumer company, and it's hard to find diverse users for UX research? Just watched everyone just make a huge sigh, because this is an eternal problem. This is a tricky situation for sure.
Exactly, and I'm happy to take credit. First by acknowledging that user research in enterprise companies is a different ballgame than a consumer. So I'll attack it from the beginning, which is that in an enterprise company, your users, you need to get to them through relationships with someone else in the company who has relationships with that customer. So you need to, as a designer, a researcher, or whatnot, get invested with your product managers and your sales folks on getting involved in the customer relationship so that you can build that bridge to even get to the point where you can start talking about research. The other thing maybe I could say about this is like, there's having a diverse user base available for user testing and that kind of thing, and that's the difficult part. I'm kind of spitballing here, but I think that you can make the argument back to what Josh was saying about, just keep pounding around this importance that, like, there's a spectrum of humanity in our customer base, and we need to identify that and solve for it. You're not going to be always able to point to a particular user or user base and get the feedback loop with them, but just culturally acknowledging that like there's a spectrum we need to account for. Just not that up on.
I think maybe an angle to approach this from, and I wanted to ask Gintel about this, is sometimes you do the best you can. You release the product sort of with some known places where you're not measuring up to your own ideals, and you gather evidence about how it's working post-launch. So I wanted to ask Gintel how you assess the impact of your designs once they've been released and how that affects changes you make after the fact.
Yeah, great. I would say there's definitely some KPIs that you could use. There's things that you could zone in around behavior, and a lot of those things are like abandonment rate and like seeing the number of page views, or if they're able to successfully do the task that you have in the product. Also see maybe how long it takes them to complete that task. And some other things too that I kind of have from when my earlier days when my design was more connected to marketing is like things around loyalty and that may be like an NPS, like a net promoter score, or just going in on usability, or even just like gauging like whether they enjoy the appearance and maybe having surveys around that to kind of be things that you consistently look at so that if there is a problem that comes up and you're seeing maybe metrics aren't what you guys are expecting, you could kind of get back into that problem space.
I wanted to ask, because we've got a group of folks who are really seasoned here, and I've seen pretty much everyone on here run like all the kinds of research you can, quant and qual and before and after and workshops and everything. I wanted to ask, starting with Josh, how has your process for understanding users changed since you started your career? And what's different now?
Oh, geez, everything. Oh my God, where do I even begin? It's changed radically. I think especially, being an accessibility specialist now, the way that I see people with disabilities in my work has radically changed. When I first started out, I unconsciously excluded and flattened people as edge cases in my work. Like going back to what Gintel was saying, right? It's so easy to do that. And I thought about accessibility in terms of compliance and checklists, not in terms of actual people. And, the reality that there's so many differences in which people with disabilities navigate the web, even down to the assistive technology that they use. That's how I learned how to design, unconsciously or not. We have like in the design world, like focusing on happy paths, getting to an MVP, design thinking of like other temporarily able-bodied people in like a D-school classroom is like glorified. Hallway tests and gorilla sampling. Like there's that ableist, you only need to test with 5 users article that was published by Nielsen Norman like 2 decades ago, and people are still referencing it. Tom Griever wrote like a sexist book on using confidence to like articulate design decisions, and like cited The Art of Charm, which is like a website for picking up women. Like historically, just thinking about our space as designers, UX design and HCI has been ableist because it often doesn't really recognize accessibility head on as a requirement or just a normal part of the human condition. Instead, like as Gintel kind of pointed out, oftentimes it's often relegated as like an edge case, like as a subchapter, a side note, or a tip, and that really sucks. Now, what's really changed is I don't see people with disabilities as an edge case. I see them as people. As once again, as Gintel said, all of us are going to be edge cases at some point in our lives. All of us are going to experience a disability at some point in our lives, and we're all going to know what it's like to be rejected by technology in our own unique ways, depending on the intersections of our disabilities, race, gender, and so forth. So in terms of actual changes to my process, it really started with awareness. So knowing when to say, I don't know, instead of ever relying on assumptions, because they're really, really dangerous. Side note, Sherry Byrne-Haber recently wrote a book called Giving a Damn About Accessibility, made a point that even the highest of highest, like accessibility managers, they never assume. That's like their key motto, because even if they have a lived experience of a disability for which they're actually designing for, 3 different screen reader users can interact with the web in a countless number of ways, depending on their lived experiences and their backgrounds. Other things that have changed, making sure, you as a designer right now can influence how you do design, right, at your company. What tools are you using, right? That really influences who is going to actually be able to be hired into your company. Can people with disabilities work at your company? You have a part in that. Changing corporate culture. Changing how I recruit with people with disabilities in research to be more proactive and intentional. So say if you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of time, you don't have access to a lot of people, instead of just doing a random hallway test or guerrilla convenience sampling, you could use critical case sampling, where you specifically pick a small number of folks who represent very complicated intersections. So say, for example, if you were to do an interview with a Black veteran with acquired blindness who has a screen reader, designing for her is going to likely solve the needs of so many more people instead of talking to just several temporarily able-bodied white men, right? Which often tends to be the case when you do convenience sampling. Or thinking about what methods you're using during that research. Is it accessible? I know I talked about this earlier, but if every interview, if your entire research really lies on just doing video interviews in Zoom, who is that going to be excluding? So maybe let's see more diary studies. And I've gone well past my time, so I'll stop there. Oh no, did we lose our? She's back. She's back.
Hi, folks. The screen went completely blank for me just for a second. I got terrified, and I'm here again. I am a little bit bummed that I missed the tail end of your insights there, because I really appreciate your response. So we have about 10 minutes left to go in the session. For folks who are watching, if you have Q&As, please get them in now, because we've got 9 minutes left. Want to give you all the insight we possibly can in 9 minutes. But I wanted to open to the group, starting with Tim, because I remember you talking about days when you worked at Cooper and were doing design for a sort of wide range of people and coming away really surprised. What is something you've learned in talking to users that surprised you?
One thing that comes to mind is actually a project at Pivotal. I was working on a monitoring interface for a big database system. And we had a pretty good relationship with our main customers. And we understood their context, we saw what they were doing. Typically, you'd see our interface up on a big monitor in the workspace with the status of the database and all of its components and stuff. They were database architects, they were data managers who had the 3 screens set up and all this stuff, and so we were focusing our the scale essentially of our interface around these use cases. And we also had a big, a significant customer base in China, India. And I went on a trip there to go do some customer visits. And we walked into, it was a big travel logistics company in China. And we walk into the big office space, and I look around, and the first thing I see is where are all the computers? Right? And it's they didn't have a dual monitor set up on everyone's desk like you used to here in the US and Silicon Valley and whatnot, right? And banks and all that. And we go, and they had computers. They were a little monitor and then whatever. And then we go over to talk to our main database architect who we worked with, who was the main kind of manager of the system. And she comes to meet us, and she picks up this 13-inch little PC laptop, right? With the 3 toolbars on it, and her interface was like, 800 pixels high. And I was almost embarrassed that I had forgotten, because I've been working in the web since literally 640 by 480 resolution, right? And I was embarrassed that I forgot that the world doesn't have big plasma monitors on the wall. And that really reframed our thinking of oh my God, we have to make sure that we have this other entirely separate content that we need to make sure we're designing.
So, with 5 minutes remaining, I have a little bit of a goodbye planned, not too much, but I'm going to really thank everybody who's here and around the table and ask if you had any closing thoughts or points that you really wanted to make before we go.
I took a course on technology, ethics, and public policy this past winter, and one of the books that we read was a book called Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill. And one of the points she makes is that if you're building, a machine learning algorithm and you train that algorithm using biased training data, what you're going to get is a biased algorithm. And I think that's just an interesting thing for us to keep in mind, because in our work, we are building the algorithm. We're manually doing this. We're not AI, we're humans, but we are subject to the same, biases that an algorithm would be. So I think it's up to us to be ethical in terms of where we're getting our own training data.
That's awesome. Anyone else?
I can have a couple of words.
Yeah, go for it.
For all the designers on the call, if you're doing anything within the space design for the web, just really encouraging y'all to maybe learn a little bit of semantic HTML. It goes a very long way, because the way that, I know I traditionally learned design was very much cited, and it was very much rooted in this ableist bias that hey, I'm a sighted person, I'm going to design experiences from a sighted perspective. But once you learn more about semantic HTML, the superpowers these little elements have and how they interact with assistive technology, that goes such a long way. And you'll learn how to design for sensory experiences that aren't just limited to someone's eyes. So I strongly recommend that, and also joining the accessibility community. We're a great, amazing group of people. Everyone is super welcoming and nice. For those of you who are curious, Ally Slack, A11Y Slack is a great place to start. You can message them on Twitter and ask to join the community just so you can start learning. Ally, for those of you unaware, 11, there's within accessibility, it's 11 words between the A and the Y, so Ally. But yeah, that's my little talk.
I have one thought.
I never knew where that acronym was from. Thank you. Gintel, sorry.
Okay. So I know from my previous experiences, I was in a lot of positions where I was kind of siloed and I was the only design person there. So I just wanted to recommend a book, the User Experience Team of One, a research and design survival guide. It's by Leah Bewley. And it's something that I have found super useful for when I am trying to do either something quick and dirty because I'm only by myself there, or I just want to know okay, what other tests can I do to perform to validate to feel better about my design. So yeah, just a recommendation.
That's fantastic. All right. So I want to thank all of our speakers for all of their insights one more time, and especially folks who have been posting links in the chat. I've seen it happen. I'm really excited to go back through this whole conversation and click on all these links and learn all this stuff. But before we wrap up, I wanted to plug the blog series that Carbon 5 did around intersectionality and building products. And I wanted to really encourage everybody on the call to take the survey and to really keep talking about this to each other, within your company, and with me because I really want to keep learning. So I hope everybody has a great day. And thank you so much for your time.